Is this for squirting if they don't pay attention? Is it? Okay, everybody's here. Okay, welcome everybody to this morning's presentation. I'm Professor Mark Button. I'm going to talk to you today about what I just got as iceberg or hype, assessing the extent of fraud and fraudsters. Now, I'm actually not going to talk a great deal about the extent of fraud, but what I am going to talk a lot more about is the extent of fraudsters. And I'm going to look at some research that we've done here, and David was also involved in this project and crunched a lot of the numbers of the alternative bodies that deal with fraud and what that adds to the numbers in terms of the true extent of fraud in the UK population. And in doing that, I will discuss some of those bodies because I think it's quite interesting in how they deal with fraud in terms of, adjudicate whether an individual is a fraudster of some type. So, first of all, I think it's important to note that you're obviously studying in a criminology department. I suspect a lot of you are probably public sector fraud people, some of you might be in the private sector as well, so you'll be aware of some of the very different ways that fraud is dealt with. And when you sit with the other distance learning criminology students, probably a lot of those from the police type backgrounds or focused on that area, their whole mindset will be around the criminal justice system. That is the kind of traditional criminological paradigm that crime is dealt with by the criminal justice system. And that is the kind of end point of what happens when people commit crime. But with fraud, what I'm going to show you today is there are a much wider range of organisations in the public and the private sector with varying degrees of sophistication that deal with fraud and essentially designate the status of fraudster to individuals, just like a criminal court does to criminals. And I want to kind of throw these statistics in to kind of, first of all, illustrate that. David has probably, I know, already discussed to you the fraud indicator that we do, the latest one, which will be published, hopefully, fingers crossed, next week. But the last one, £193 billion cost of fraud. Even if you go back to the old fraud indicator produced by the now defunct National Fraud Authority, we were looking at about a £50 billion problem. Now, if you look at the actual number of individuals that go through the criminal justice system for a fraud-related offence, look at that table at the top there, 15,708 on average in the 2 census years we looked at. Now, if you divided that by 190 billion, in my kind of rough maths, that's about £12.5 million per fraudster, which is plainly, completely bonkers, isn't it? That is not the average fraud. There are obviously a lot more fraudsters out there than those 15,000. So what happens to them? Now, the traditional criminological paradigm is this concept of attrition, that you get people obviously committing crime who don't get caught, and that sort of takes out a big percentage. Then you get those that are caught, and then you get kind of a very, very small number going down to 1 or 2% that end up actually with some kind of criminal conviction. So huge attrition. The vast majority of those are obviously offenders that are never caught or never actually, there's not enough evidence to convict them. So is that what's happening with fraud? Have we got huge amounts of attrition? Are there lots and lots of people committing fraud that are never getting caught and getting away with it? Are there huge numbers of the population engaged in fraudulent type behaviours? Well, clearly, what I'm going to say to you is, yes, there are lots of people getting away with it and not getting caught, But what I'm also going to show you is that there are lots and lots of people who do get caught engaging in fraud, but they just get dealt with and designated as some kind of fraudster by another type of body. And note that figure there, that's all offenders dealt with by the criminal justice system. The average was 1.4 million, and the figures that I will put up towards the end of this lecture, just to kind of, in your head, imagine how many people are getting done for some kind of fraud each year. First of all, just to kind of give you some background of what we did, and sort of David did a lot of this work, so big hands up to him there. It was a study funded by the Nuffield Foundation, a very prestigious body, and we wanted to look at a number of different areas where we thought there was a lot of people being designated as fraudsters outside of the criminal justice system. So we wanted to look at regulators, and these are regulators in the public sector, the private sector. We wanted to look at contempt of court, which is a civil means to deal with fraud, and we thought there might be bigger numbers there. And we also wanted to look at fraudster databases, which we also thought was another way that organisations are dealing with fraud. So we kind of put together a list of all these organisations. So some of these organisations in the public sector, so we could submit freedom of information requests to get information on the number of cases. Some of them, we just wrote to and they kindly supplied information. Some, it was just pure hard graft. We had to go through publicly available websites, trawl through the cases, identify cases that looked fraudulent, and then sort of write those cases up. We focused on the census years 2014 and 15, and we did an average of those. Just to note, we kind of focused on England and Wales, so apologies to anyone Scottish or Northern Irish, but that made it much more difficult to do. We didn't focus on local authority activities or trading standards. We didn't look at bodies with no public evidence of having dealt with fraud cases, or extremely rare. We didn't look at civil courts, bar the contempt of court issue. And we didn't look at ombudsman services or bodies dealing solely with organisations rather than individual fraudsters. So, although we did list a lot of those, so if you go to the Centre for Counter Fraud Studies website, we have put together a database. Those who are interested, you can get a list of all the organisations that do have some kind of role with fraud, whether for individuals or organisations, for those who are interested. So that exceeded it down a fair bit, but we still had lots and lots of organisations. In terms of the cases, so let's just imagine, say, the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Now, it's a regulatory body for nurses. They put cases on their website. Now, some of those cases might be a nurse, for instance, who's had sex with a patient. Obviously, no fraud-related issue there. Or a nurse that's incompetent, who's been giving the wrong drugs. But you also get cases of nurses who, say, have fiddled their overtime expenses or lied about administering drugs to a patient, when they haven't, so a kind of fraudulent type offence. So we had to go through each of these cases, and there are lots and lots of these cases, to determine whether we thought it was a fraudulent case. And if we did, we added it to our database. The tests that we applied on whether they were there the principal ingredients of behaviour which could fit the Fraud Act? So was there some kind of misrepresentation or failing to declare something or some kind of abuse of authority? Were there evidence of similar cases prosecuted under this legislation, that looked quite similar? And if that was the case, then we included them. Now, we assessed 3,750 cases. And then from that, we found 720 fraudulent-related cases from the regulatory bodies, which we were then able to kind of do lots of analysis. And again, the report is published. Those who are interested can get hold of the report afterwards and have a look at that report. Just to start to give you a flavour of some of the different organisations that we looked at, and we put them into a number of different categories. So first of all, government regulators. These are organisations that are part of the government. Now, top of there, you've got the Department for Work and Pensions. Now, obviously, they deal with welfare and benefits fraud, and obviously they do a lot of criminal investigations and cases. Some of you here may well be that kind of investigator, but they obviously also do non-criminal sanctions. So we've got some numbers in terms of individuals dealt with for social security fraud that haven't been dealt with for the criminal justice system. Similarly, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs has similar kind of arrangements. But then you've got the Insolvency Service. You have individuals in certain cases who've set up companies and done things in a kind of what we would regard the core ingredients of a fraudulent type scheme, who are dealt with by the Insolvency Service purely in terms of being struck off as a director rather than actually dealt with through the criminal courts. Judges, people who sit on tribunals, they have their own regulator, which is outside of the criminal justice system. Teachers, there's this organisation called the National College of Teaching and Leadership, and some quite interesting and juicy cases of fraud there where teachers have been engaged in different types of fraud. Then we've got free prescription fraud, where people claim exemptions, and fare evasion. And for various reasons, we only got the tip of the iceberg here. We've got Transport for London, we get the stats for them, but obviously there is fare evasion, which is a kind of species of fraud as far as we're concerned, across a much wider range of organisations than just Transport for London. So again, when you look at the statistics at the end of this lecture, again, think of it as a kind of, it's not the full picture, it's only a significant part of the picture. Then we've got delegated regulators. So you're probably struggling to read that. I mean, even I'm struggling to read that there, so sorry about that. These are bodies that have been given powers by legislation to regulate particular types of activity. And these bodies, we have found, also deal with fraudulent-related cases in a number of different ways. So, top of the list there, the Architects Registration Board. We've got the Bar Standards Board, the Bar Tribunals and Adjudication Service to deal with, obviously, barristers. The Care Council for Wales, the Civil Aviation Authority, the Financial Conduct Authority, another interesting one, the Gambling Commission, the General Medical Council, General Optical Council, General Pharmaceutical Council, Phone Pay Plus. That's a kind of slightly interesting one. That's actually a kind of contracted out regulator. So it's a whole list of bodies there. So we went through cases in all these different types of bodies to produce some statistics. And then we've got self-regulators. These are bodies that just regulate their own, if you like, profession outside of any particular legislation. And a lot of these are sporting bodies and professional accountancy-related bodies. So, for the Football Association, there's obviously quite a few ladies here, but some of you might be into football, but you regularly see footballers who are disciplined by the FA for, obviously usually doing something violent on the football pitch or, something related to that. But there have also been cases of footballers, for instance, who have been engaged in, sort of betting-related, corruption-related issues to do with their playing, who have been dealt with by the Football Association outside of the criminal justice system. And another big one that falls into that category is the British Horse Racing Authority. Again, lots of examples of jockeys, trainers implicated in corruption-related scandals. And again, if you can go through their website and find lots of cases of corruption that they have dealt with, and again, with no reference to the criminal justice system. So, some interesting examples here. And then we have fraudster databases. Now, some people immediately think, well, is this a form of justice? But let's look at Cyphers, for instance. Mr. Bloggs decides they want to get a mortgage, The salary they earn doesn't entitle them to the mortgage they need, so they fabricate some documents claiming to have a higher salary and submit that to their bank to get a mortgage. The bank discovers this, the person has committed fraud. Does the bank hand the person over to the police and the criminal justice system? No, very, very unlikely. What happens is they reject the loan and they put the person on the Cyphers fraudster database. The person's on that database for 8 years. They are designated as a fraudster. So Cyphers, National Hunter, and the Insurance Fraud Register, those are the three prominent ones, are examples of private systems of justice. And as you'll see later, large numbers of individuals who have been found to have engaged in fraudulent behaviour, who, as a consequence of that behaviour, end up on these databases, a form of private justice. And then we have contempt of court. This one is, when we started this project, we thought this was very exciting, and we were thinking, maybe there's hundreds of people being dealt with for fraudulent related offences through contempt of court, a kind of civil means to deal with fraud. But as you'll see with the statistics shortly, it turned out to be a much, much smaller number of individuals. But still, it's quite an interesting area which some organisations, particularly insurance companies, are using to deal with fraudsters. So, under the Civil Procedure 32.14, proceedings for contempt of court may be brought against a person if he makes or causes to be made a false statement in a document verified by a statement of truth without an honest belief in its truth. And you can bring civil proceedings under that scheme, under this category, because a committal application in relation to a false statement of truth or disclosure in connection with the proceedings in a High Court, Divisional Court, Court of Appeal may be made only with the permission of the court dealing with the proceedings in which the false statement or disclosure statement was made, or by the Attorney General. So essentially, if you kind of make some kind of insurance claim and you sort of knowingly lie on that claim, and then they obviously uncover that, this is a means for the insurance companies to deal with you through this civil procedure rather than through the criminal justice procedure. It's the criminal standard of proof. You can get up to 2 years of imprisonment, but because it's a civil court, the guilt is determined by a judge, not a jury. Legal aid is available for the defendants, and it's used in a small number of cases. And this is we did some interviews with research as well, and this senior fraud investigator, he said, might either be, so the claimant might try to discontinue the claim, and we decide the case is serious enough that we want to go down the contempt route, or it might be through trial. The judge decides himself that it is fraud, and we then apply to take it down the contempt route. So it's quite advanced into the claim. So if someone submitted a claim and it's been repudiated within 2 months and they just walk away, wouldn't tend to happen on that kind. So just to give you some stats, we went through various searches, and that's the number of people. So we had a peak year in 2012 was 18 people. 2015, the last year that we assessed, only 12. So not big numbers. Very, very small niche area to deal with fraudsters. So that didn't really add much to our kind of 15,000 offenders as we thought it might do. But as you'll see later, there is more to come. Before I look at some of those statistics to kind of illustrate the size of what's going on outside of the criminal justice system, I just wanted to kind of just talk a little bit about the justice systems that are in operation. And we divided it into these following categories, what we called fixed penalty type justice. So just like a parking, when you get a parking ticket, a kind of very summary form of justice where you're just, designated as a fraudster in a very simple way, very simplistic process with very, small, if at all, sanctions as a consequence of that process. We'll look at some of the examples that fit that. Then we start to get slightly more sophisticated, what we call regulatory justice. And this we divided into public and private. Now, public in the sense that the proceedings of that justice finds its way into the public domain. So, you can go and watch, or you can go to a website and find out what happened on a particular case. But there is also some regulatory justice which is more sophisticated than fixed penalty justice, but which is done in private, where the individual's name does not come into the public domain. And then we found that the final type, what we call tribunal regulatory justice, which is kind of, if you like, the closest to the criminal justice system, in the sense that you have, quite extensive, complicated proceedings with barristers or equivalent, with persons presiding over the case in, quite a kind of complex way. And we'll briefly look at some examples of that. So first of all, fixed penalty justice. This is the kind of the simplest and the lowest level type frauds. It tends to be very low penalties. So, if we're looking at a sanction, it's usually, in the tens of pounds, maybe hundreds of pounds. If a sanction at all, it tends to be very high volume. The outcomes are often the focus of the investigator's investigation, rather than the result of an independent individual or body determining guilt. There's normally uniform penalties, and sometimes there is scope for the offender to contest this, but often that's only afterwards on an appeal-based basis. So one of the best examples of this is in the NHS, the penalty charges for prescription fraud, where individuals who falsely claim an exemption to get a certificate, if they're found to have done this, get an administrative penalty, and it's a fine. And so those of you interested in this, there's the guidance the NHS produced for this, and I'll give you some statistics on the numbers a bit later in the lecture. Okay, then we move on to the next level, regulatory justice, but private. This tends to happen for a much wider range of frauds, not just low-level ones. It's often license-related, but not always. And it's often related to failure to be a fit and proper person. It also tends to be low volume. We're talking in the dozens of cases, at most hundreds, that are normally multiple reviews of decisions. The decisions are often taken, if you like, outside of a formal hearing, so it's not like a court case. It's usually decision makers, although those decision makers are usually independent of the investigators, although they might not be independent of the organisation. Sometimes there are opportunities for the individuals being investigated to make written and or oral representations to, contest the findings. And the guilt and penalties, as I said, are determined by staff separate from those investigating. And the penalties range from low to very tough. And some examples, so for instance, the Security Industry Authority, which license the private security industry. There's certain behaviours you might engage in which will lead to your license potentially being revoked. And they will have a kind of, if you like, a group of civil servants that will assess the case, assess the evidence, and then come to their own conclusion. And if they come to the conclusion that you lose your license, that's it. So the SIA, the Driver Vehicle Standards Agency, and then the Civil Aviation Authority, which I've got an example here. So here is a case relating to an individual. The other important thing to note in these is that individuals' names don't go into the public domain. So the SIA and the CAA, they don't put the individuals there. They keep the name secret. So here we have decision, CAA followed a review pursuant to Regulation 6 of the Supervision Authority Regulations. And you can see the 2 board members who made this decision. So the regulations review was at the request of Mr. H in a letter dated 6th of May. Mr. H requested his review based on the decision of SIJ to suspend and propose to revoke Mr. H's Category B2 aircraft maintenance license. So as you see, it's related to Mr. H, not his full name. Mr. H had asserted that you did not have the required experience for the issue of an aircraft maintenance license. You applied to the SRG for an aircraft maintenance license in February 2012. Assessed Mr. H application conducted that Mr. H did meet the required competency standards. The license was subsequently issued. SRG received anonymous emails in February and March questioning the legitimacy of the personal experience recorded on Mr. H's original license application as a direct result of this information. So essentially, in this case, it is someone lying on their application to get a license. So, dishonesty, fraud, and obviously the end point of this case is Mr. H losing his license. That is the sanction. But I just put some arrows, some of the key points there. So that is an example of private justice, a kind of fraudulent related behaviour. And we found some other cases like this, but the CA deal with. Invariably, they're to do with individuals lying about CPD, about experience to kind of keep their licenses. So that kind of fraudulent behaviour. Okay, and that's just the final result. Okay, the next level up is regulatory justice, but this differs from the previous example in that this happens in the public domain. There are public decisions. So again, we get the full range of different types of frauds being dealt with. Again, it's low volume. We're talking in the dozens, of cases per year. There are, again, multiple review of decisions. There are also, again, opportunities for the offender to make written or oral representations in their case, and guilt and penalties determined by staff separate from those investigating. And again, the penalties range from low to tough. The big examples here are the Financial Conduct Authority, the Gambling Commission, and the Gangmasters Licence Authority. Particularly the FCA and the Gambling Commission, you can go to their website and find lots of cases of what we regard the species of fraud. Some quite, particularly the FCA, some quite juicy, cases of bankers and other financial services personnel, defrauding quite significant sums of money out of organisations, sometimes in the millions of pounds, but being dealt with purely by the FCA outside of the criminal justice system. But this is an example from the Gambling Commission. The Gambling Commission obviously regulates the gambling sector, but in terms of this area that's interesting to us, it's casinos. And you get, again, lots of examples of, sort of engaged in all kinds of fraudulent type behaviours that, because of that, lose their licence. So here we have Giovanni Maria Milazzo. The Commission decided to revoke the personal functional licence issued to Mr. Giovanni under the provisions of 119 of the Act on the grounds that he was considered an unsuitable person to carry the licence activities authorised by his licence. The reason he colluded with a customer on at least 2 separate occasions, first allowed the customer to gain the sum of £1,125 and secondly the sum of £525 illegally. The licensee was an experienced croupier, and for that reason it is improbable that his actions could be explained as a genuine mistake. So there are lots of those types of cases of staff-type frauds in casinos where individuals, once they've been kind of found to have done that, get dealt with by the Gambling Commission and not the criminal justice system. Although there are some cases where it's more than that. It's the individual gets like hung, drawn, and quartered because they lose their job, they go to the regulator, and they go to the criminal justice system. Although that is quite rare. So we have the name, actual names, the reason, and the case. Okay, so moving on now to tribunal regulatory justice. Now, this is the most sophisticated form of justice dealing with fraud-related cases outside of the criminal justice system. And here you have the full range of frauds, again, being dealt with. Again, it's low volume. But there's even clearer distinctions in these bodies between those responsible for investigation, prosecution, and the determination of guilt and allocation of penalties. I mean, in essence, on a lot of these bodies, they're almost effectively judges in terms of the independence they have, in terms of their linkages to the organisations actually investigating. So there's formal hearings where evidence is presented, contested, and witnesses can be cross-examined. These almost always take place in public as well. You can go and watch them, and as part of this project, we did go and watch some cases. I went to a social worker that was being tempted to be struck off for fraud-related offences, and I also a barrister. I went to one of the barrister hearings, and very, very formal processes. This is, I can't remember which one this is, but it kind of gives you a kind of illustration, of the way these places are set out and how formal they are. You'll have, I think probably here you have the kind of the witness that's been interviewed by the court. You have the tribunal members. Normally it's 3. They normally have an independent, a lay person, and a professional in most cases. Then if you like, prosecution, solicitors, and then the defence, and the individual may be represented by a barrister or a trade union representative, those types of individuals. Very much like a criminal court, the kind of charges will be read out, then they'll go through the evidence, where the kind of, if you like, the prosecution puts forward the case, and then the defence obviously can kind of try and dispute that, and the defence put forward their case, and then they'll come to a decision. They walk out of the room, it's kind of deliberate, and then they come back in, and then they issue their decision. And decisions vary from regulatory body to regulatory body. Some of these regulatory bodies can actually fine an individual as well, or impose costs. So, you've got that aspect. But obviously the most significant thing which is at stake in most of these is the license to practice. Now, for some, that might not be as significant as others, but you think about, say, a doctor, a doctor, who's spent 7 years in medical school and, God knows how much training, and engaged in some kind of fraud, and they're in a body like this, and their license to practice is on the line. That's obviously a significant thing, probably far more significant than if it was a kind of criminal case. Obviously, for some occupations, maybe it's not as significant, where you need less training, but probably still for a lot of occupations that is an important thing. So, but that's just one example to kind of illustrate what it looks like. And here's an example from the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal. And in this particular case, following a traffic accident, AP reduced his working hours but continued to draw a full-time salary without earning the appropriate fee level. He withdrew money from the client account and paid it directly into his personal bank account, causing a client shortfall and demise of the firm. The value of the fraud was £300,000. And this particular person was struck off as a solicitor, so again, significant penalty there, and also had to pay £26,000 worth of costs. This person wasn't dealt with in the criminal justice system. So I think it's quite a significant, fraud. You might think, or anyone engaged in that level of fraud should be in the criminal justice system. But it kind of gives you a sort of example there. So we came up with this model of the quality of justice related to the kind of severity of punishment. So if you look at the very top, going across, the further from the left to right you go, the more severe the punishments. And obviously you've got punishments ranging from the kind of one end of the extreme, private shaming, public shaming, non-custodial penalties, including financial through to custody. Obviously, with criminal justice system, you've got the full range of those available. With contempt of court, you also have the full range, but obviously you only have a maximum of 2 years custody, so it doesn't go the full way across. Then we have regulatory tribunal justice, which goes as far as the financial penalties. The regulatory administrative justice, again, goes that far. The regulatory administrative justice private, again, not as far across. Fixed penalty justice. And then the fraudster registers, again, the least across in terms of severity of punishment. And obviously, the further down you go, the lesser the quality of justice. Now, a lot of people would argue how good a quality the criminal justice system is, you know, get miscarriage of justice, all those kinds of things. You know, clearly, if you're looking at kind of some of the basic indicators of quality of justice, you know, the criminal justice can be these by, you know, if you go to the very bottom, fraudster registers, you know, looking at determining without any, you know, independent outside organisational review, was constantly placed on registers, so kind of very low quality justice with possibly the opportunities for many more mistakes. So we thought that was a good way to kind of conceptualise these different types of justice that are operating to deal with fraud. Okay. Now, the bit you've all been waiting for. I think you have anyway. So how many fraudsters are dealt with? Well, the top figure here, total numbers of fraudsters we found in our census year, designated by a formal body of some kind as a fraudster, just over 1 million people. Okay, so how do we break that down? Well, see, at the top we've got the criminal, and we've got criminal excluding TV licensing and criminal including TV licensing. And obviously, there's a significant number dealt with for not having a TV license. And I know some people would debate whether that is actually fraud, but we've taken it as fraud, and we've taken the lead from the National Fraud Authority, which included it as a fraud. So for that reason, we did include it. Contempt of court, as I kind of alluded earlier, not that many, 12 in our census year, so didn't really add much to it. But then we look at regulatory justice, and this is regulatory justice of the general public rather than occupations. So the NHS, in terms of prescription evasion, 606,000 people, so large numbers of people not, you know, sort of being honest and trying to get free prescriptions. The DWP sanctions outside of the criminal justice, just over 10,000. HMRC just short of 15,000. And then the insolvency service just over 1,100. So some quite significant numbers there in terms of numbers of fraudsters. And then we have Transport for London. These are people who have been sanctioned for fare evasion. And that's obviously only London, 100,000. So again, these figures just kind of, you know, when you just look at that as a snapshot of the country, I don't think London's any more dishonest than the rest of the country. Or maybe they are, I don't know, but certainly not my kind of experience. So if you kind of multiply that across the country, you know, you probably add, you know, at least another 1 million, you know, people across the country, you know, for kind of fare evasion. And then we've got the professions, occupations, regulators that we went through. For the census years, 395 individuals dealt with for fraudulent-related behaviours who were sanctioned by those regulatory bodies. And then CIFUS. Now, the fraudster databases, first of all, the Insurance Fraud Register wouldn't give us the stats, but they said it was in the tens of thousands, but that was no good for us. We wanted the exact numbers. So we couldn't add that. We got the numbers from National Hunter, but a lot of the National Hunter numbers also dovetail with CIFUS. So we would have probably been double counting if we threw in the National Hunter numbers as well. So we've just thrown in the CIFUS numbers, and that's the number of people added to their database, well, there are two databases, although one is much bigger than the other one. So they've got the staff fraud database and they've got the kind of general database. 135,000 people added in the average of the census year. So all adds up to just over 1 million people, but as I've said, you probably realistically double that again. And then what's also interesting is look at the number of people in the criminal justice system being convicted, 1.4 million. A very interesting question, do they kind of dovetail? Are these the same people? You know, those people getting convicted for all kinds of things from, you know, theft through to kind of, you know, violence-related things. Are they also the ones, or are we going into a different section of the community? Well, I think the reality is probably we are looking at a much wider spread than just the kind of, if you like, traditional criminal classes. But it just goes to show, I think, when we kind of look at these statistics in context, and we often have these big numbers of how big a problem fraud is, you know, the kind of indicator that I mentioned, and also think about the crime survey for England and Wales now, you know, 5 million, you know, victims of fraud-related crimes. You know, where are all the offenders? Well, obviously some of those offenders aren't getting caught and aren't going into any kind of system, but there are a lot of offenders who are getting caught and they're getting dealt with by these other systems. And obviously are a lot of individuals engaged in fraudulent related behaviours. So, to conclude, a significant part of the attrition related to fraud can be accounted for by the alternatives to the criminal justice system. There are lots of these systems. It is what, you know, I've called before a fraud justice network rather than system. You know, lots of these different bodies, some of them linked together, some not. You know, very different from traditional criminology and criminal justice, dealing with fraud. And there are probably as many, if not more, formally sanctioned for fraud by somebody as there are persons convicted for any kind of crime in a typical year. Okay, that's it. Happy to take questions and comments.